G'day, I see Temple. Good to see you there. Miss Temple. Paul is here with us. Good to see you, Paul. Welcome, everyone. I hear you, Paul. I hear you, man. Well, it's good to see you here nonetheless. And the beauty of this is that it will be here for you as long as YouTube keeps it here, which I don't know how long that might be. Mike Z, aloha. How's it going? Good to see you too, Mike Z. We'll give a few more people a chance to catch up, to get the notification and come on in, because today we're going to be talking about, let me go ahead and pull my microphone over here. Now, I have the microphone on me so I can make sure you guys can hear me. There's Silky Slim. Alright, so today we have a, well, you know, this is one of those touchy issues that may or may not incite a riot on my head, or may or may not incite YouTube to sanction the video or something. I don't know why. I can't see why. We're just going to tell the truth. Just going to tell it like it is. So today we're dealing with, well, obviously, good to see you there, Satan Slayer. Welcome. So today we're dealing with this issue of course, this massive, I don't know, massive might not be the right word, but this very intense movement that's going on in our world. Let me turn the camera. It's going on in this country, okay, and most of the world. There we go. So we're going to be talking specifically about Antifa, BLM, any of these movements and the people that support them, their leaders, not necessarily the grunts, not necessarily the people that they make go out in the street and do their bidding. Because as I'm going to argue today, I think what we're watching, what we're seeing happen around us as part of a one world globalist religious movement, which it is. Many of the people that are part of it don't realize it's religious, but it is a religious movement nonetheless. That in this movement, we're seeing a definite, at least you can make a very strong argument that the motivations that are underlying Antifa, BLM, much of the United Nations for that matter, can be shown, can be identified with the same type of actions as satanic cults. And I have shared, I'm going to say this several times during this stream so that everyone has an opportunity to see it. There is a link in the description, way down at the bottom, to a document called Satanic Cult Awareness. It's nothing brand new. It's not like I went out and discovered something. Many people know about this. It's a document that law enforcement created back in the late 80s and early 90s in order to figure out how to deal with satanic cults in their jurisdictions. How to identify, is this a cult, was this a cult crime or whatever when they're investigating one. And then specifically to try to figure out how to figure out which cult it came from. But overall, understanding what is a satanic cult and what are the attributes of a group. When you see a group of people or a person and they've taken on some kind of new movement, some new ideology, how do we know? How can we tell? What are the attributes that we look for to say, aha, this person looks like they've been co-opted by a satanic cult? So this goes pretty deep. I want to show you. I have quite a bit of material to get to today. I don't think I'll get to all of it because it's just too much. But I'm going to make my case that what we see going on in the streets today is the product of satanic cult activity. Satanic cults don't just exist in little block buildings out in the middle of the woods. They're in corporate boardrooms. They're in your government. They're everywhere. They're in the United Nations. They're all over the world. So it's important that we understand what we're dealing with here. So I'm going to start off with we're going to be hearing the word Jesuit quite a bit during this presentation. Excuse me. And this is, I want to make it clear, this presentation is not necessarily a hit piece on the Jesuits. It's not what this piece is about here. But you're going to be hearing their name because their founder, Ignatius Loyola, or Ignatius of Loyola, is what many would say he is the initiator of what we see today as this New Age movement, this New Age spirituality. Now, he was from the 1500s, so that's a long time. So his influence has had a long time to take. So I'm going to start off with a little introduction here by Dr. Alberto Rivera, a former Jesuit priest. And this comes from the introduction to a book called The Secret History of the Jesuits, written by a man named Edmund Paris. It's a good book. It's a book with a well-researched and cited book. A lot of good resources to find just from the back of that book, just from the bibliography. But Alberto Rivera wrote the introduction to that book, and what he said in his introduction is perfect for what we're going to talk about today. He says this. This plane goes over. Good time. Alberto Rivera says this: the most dangerous men are those who appear very religious, especially when they are organized and in a position of authority. They have the deep respect of the people who are ignorant of their ungodly push for power behind the scenes. These religious men who pretend to love God will resort to murder, incite revolution, and wars if necessary to help their cause. They are crafty, intelligent, smooth religious politicians. How about that? Now that's good writing and accurate. They are crafty, intelligent, smooth religious politicians who live in a shadowy world of secrets, intrigue, and phony holiness. Now, who is this actually that he's talking about? In my opinion, these would be the men and the women who are actually behind the movements that you see on the street and on the mainstream news. There has to be a source. Where does the money come from? Where do the orders come from? There has to be a hierarchy. And that's what Alberto's talking about here. This is the genesis. This is where these movements come from. He says this pattern, spiritually speaking, can be seen in, for example, in the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees of the time of Jesus Christ. This same evil spirit directed the Roman emperors to issue the 10 murderous decrees to persecute the early Christian church. Now, at the end of this presentation, if we get to that piece, I have a piece about the state of our country today and looking at how it looks exactly the way the Roman Empire did as it was falling. And how did that happen? Hopefully, all of this will lead up and answer those questions. The quote-unquote early fathers of this movement observed most of the ancient Babylonian system, plus Jewish theology and Greek philosophy. They all perverted most of the teachings of Jesus Christ and his apostles. They paved the way for the Roman Catholic machine that was to come into existence. Piously, or acting righteous with their righteous air about themselves, they attacked, perverted, added to, and took away from the Bible. This religious Antichrist spirit working through them is seen again when Ignatius Loyola created the Jesuits to secretly accomplish two major goals for the Roman Catholic institution. Number one, universal political power. Sound familiar? Number one, universal political power. Number two, a universal church. A universal church in fulfillment of the prophecies of Revelation 6, 13, 17, and 18. Now, a universal church, my friends, doesn't have to look like what we might think. The universal church, all that really means is everyone under the same roof, regardless of whether it's founded on truth, regardless of whether or not it's following Satan or Jesus Christ. They want everyone under one roof. Of course, they would not have you be following Jesus Christ, because then you couldn't fall for their deception. But anyway, it goes on to say, by the time Ignatius Loyola arrived on the scene, the Protestant Reformation had seriously damaged the Roman Catholic system. Now, this is one theme that we're going to see throughout this, is Protestantism. Those of us who are followers of Jesus Christ today, Christians in the purest sense, come mostly from a tradition of the Protestants, the Protestant Reformation, where the Catholic system was the worldwide system of religion at the time, and had been corrupted. And these men saw this, came out of it, and tried to reform the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, the Bible puts the power of the local church into the hands of a godly pastor. But the cunning of these men behind the scenes, when we follow these cults all the way to the top, these men successfully have managed over the years to remove that power and put it into the hands of denomination headquarters, regional conferences, state conferences, national conferences that tell the local churches what to do. And they've now pushed almost all of the Protestant denominations back into the arms, back under the canopy of Catholicism. This is exactly what Ignatius Loyola set out to accomplish: a universal church and the end of Protestantism. Now, you might be thinking, what in the world does this have to do with Antifa or BLM or the globalist movement or what's happening in Portland, Oregon today? Just stay tuned. You'll see that there is a parallel between the religious and political sectors in this society that we're dealing with today. Penetration and infiltration into the governments and nations of the world to manipulate the course of history by setting up dictatorships, weakening democracies such as the United States of America, by paving the way for social, political, moral, military, educational, and religious anarchy. Ignatius understood more clearly than any other leader of men who preceded him that the best way to raise a man to a certain ideal is to become master of his imagination. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how. How can you get 2,500 people to gather up, get on buses, and drive to a city, and get out of those buses and go into a place they don't even know and start rioting and burning things down in the name of a movement? How do you get people to do that? I mean, when there is no clear movement to define, it's nothing that they can really see with their eyes, that they preach the idea of change, but they never tell the people what is the change that's coming. The only change that they preach is destruction of what was, which is obviously not productive. But how do you get into the mind? How do you get into the mind and compel people to follow such movements? All right, before I continue, let me check in and see how we're doing here. All right, 30-some people. We've got a good group here. My chat's moving kind of fast. All right, let's just keep going here. Ignatius Loyola understood more clearly than any other leader of men that came before him that the best way to raise a person, to bring a person into this mindset that we're talking about, to bring them into a certain ideal or ideology, is to become master of his imagination. What does that ultimately mean? Mind control. And in just a bit, when we get through this piece right here, I'm going to bring out some of the pieces of that document that I mentioned. So those of you who are just joining in, I mentioned that there's a link in the description of this video of that links you to a document called Satanic Cult Awareness, a document put together by law enforcement to help them understand what they're looking at when they go to a crime scene that has these markers. And I'm using that document to try to help us all understand that what we're seeing in our streets, these movements, Antifa, BLM, the globalist, progressive movement altogether, at the United Nations, elements at least of the United Nations, they do bear the marks of satanic cult-like activity. We're going to make that case today. And so, as we're talking about Ignatius Loyola here, who in my opinion, and in many others, was the genesis of the New Age movement that we see today. If you could back it all up to one man, the modern New Age movement, you could see it coming out of Ignatius Loyola and the Jesuit orders, their textbook, if you will, called the Spiritual Exercises. Loyola says this: we imbue into a man or person spiritual forces which you would find very difficult to eliminate later on. Mind control. Forces more lasting than all the best principles and doctrines. These forces can come up again to the surface, sometimes after years of not even mentioning them. Once again, I say to you, mind control. And they can become so imperative that the will finds itself unable to oppose any obstacle and has to follow the irresistible impulse. That's very important. Now, this is Loyola speaking. To get the person into the state of mind where they can't even resist it, they just have to follow this irresistible impulse. What impulse? The one that has been programmed into them by the master, whoever their master happens to be. Therefore, all the truths, for example, of the Catholic dogma will have to be not only meditated, but lived and felt by the one who devotes himself to these exercises. Now, we're not talking so much about the Catholic dogma today. We're talking about the dogma of revolution. Whereas we might think of revolution in one aspect, the American Revolution, today we're looking at something altogether different. An unrighteous revolution. A revolution of evil. Satan wants to take everyone down with him. Satan knows Scripture. Satan knows what's coming. He doesn't have much time, and he wants to get everyone with him because he wants to take all of God's people down with him. And he's got his agents here in the earth working for that. And that's what we're talking about here today. These men and women who promote a specific dogma of revolution that has nothing to do with righteousness. And one of the ways that we're pointing out here is through mind control, specifically satanic, cult-like mind control. And how is it? It says here, this is really interesting too, how Ignatius Loyola explains how to get control of people and have them do your bidding. Once again here he says, the truths of this dogma that must be taught will have to be meditated and lived and felt by the one who devotes themselves to these spiritual exercises with the help of a director. Director is another term for handler. In other words, he will have to see and relive the mystery with the greatest possible intensity. So you have to put somebody through an experience. You have to put them through the experience of tearing them down, building them back up again in the image that you would have them be in. The candidate's sensitiveness becomes impregnated with these forces whose persistence is in his memory, and even more so in his subconscious, will be as strong as the effort he made to evoke and assimilate them. So, the new behaviors that they want to implant into these people, they have to put them through those. They have to make them feel the pain. They have to make them feel the urgency. Besides sight and other senses such as hearing, smell, taste, and touch will all play their part. So it's a full sensory overload to get someone into this mind state where they will revolt against peace. How do you get someone to revolt against peace? It has to be mind control. You have to convince them that what you're really looking at isn't real. You have to convince them that there is systemic racism. And imagine trying to convince someone who's never experienced it. Some white bread wasp from the suburbs, which is mostly what you see out on the streets today in these movements, outnumbering the black lives by quite a few. How do you get someone like that to understand or to get on with your movement? How do you convince them that there's a such thing as systemic racism? They've never experienced it. They don't see it. Mind control. It has to be mind control. In short, it's mere controlled autosuggestion. For example here, the angel's rebellion, Adam and Eve driven out of paradise, God's tribunal, the evangelical scenes and phases of the passion, or Jesus' suffering, are, as one would say, relived in front of the candidate. Now, this is how it would be done in, for example, the Jesuit order. How might this look today when you're trying to win over these many people to your movement? People who don't really understand your movement or even why they should revolt. How do you do that? Autosuggestion. You have to show them scenes. You have to impregnate their minds with images, sounds, and ideas, whether true or not. Sweet and blissful scenes alternate with the most somber ones. Peaceful scenes like this. And then present the candidate with scenes of terror and death and horror. And do so in a skillfully arranged rhythm. Here's what Edgar Quinet wrote. Not only visions are prearranged, but also every breath, every sigh. They're all noted down. The pauses and intervals of silence are written down like as if on a music sheet. He says here, in case you do not believe me, I will quote, the third way of praying by measuring the words and periods of silence. This particular manner of praying consists of leaving out some words between every breath, and a little further, make sure to keep equal gaps between every breath and choking sob and word. This is meditation and mantras. That's what that is. So this is why meditation, transcendental meditation and mantras, this is why we need to be, as Christians, we need to be aware of what these things do, what they cause. Because it has been, listen, it is most certainly the New Age movement that has made these people open. It has opened their hearts and minds to any suggestion that might come along, because they're all thinking in terms of there is no truth. There is no objective truth. And therefore they can be told that anything is true. Now what is the result of this sort of mind control? It means that the person whether they're inspired or not, becomes a machine. And they must sigh, sob, groan, cry, shout, yell, burn at the exact moment and in the order in which they were programmed to do. It's understandable that after 4 weeks devoted to these intensive exercises, this is the amount of time it takes to fully break someone down and rebuild them into a revolutionary or an agent for Satan, for example. 4 weeks. 4 weeks. That's how long it takes to change someone's mind around if you're doing it through this process that's outlined in the spiritual exercises of Ignatius Loyola. And this is, once again, the same practice that's used in all cults. Most cults. So it says here again, it's understandable that after 4 weeks devoted to these intensive exercises with a director or a handler as his only companion, the candidate would be ripe for the subsequent training and breaking. This is what Quinnett has to say when referring to the creator of such a hallucinatory method. He says, "Do you know what distinguishes him from all the ascetics or the monks of the past? The fact that he could observe and analyze himself logically and coldly in that state of rapture, while for all the others, even the idea of reflection was impossible." That's the goal. To change the person from a person who reflects and thinks about what they're doing. In other words, you've got to take this imprint that God has given us all. We're all made in His image. One of the ways we know we're made in His image is because in our heart we know the difference between right and wrong. Inherently. To turn someone toward your idea of revolution, you have to change inside them their idea, what God has imprinted on them. You have to remove what God has imprinted and imprint your idea of right and wrong. That's why the people who are protesting, rioting in the streets, not the protesters. I would support anyone protesting, but the riots. That's why they can't explain what their purpose is when they're asked. It's because they've been programmed. Okay, so let's move on to the next step here. All right, now I want to share with you here, before we get into the Satanic Cult Awareness document, I want to share with you here what seems to follow naturally in this study. We're going to talk a little bit about Albert Pike and his letter to Giuseppe Mazzini from August of 1871. Now, once again, I know on Days of Noah on his channel just recently talked about this letter, and he gave this caveat as well. This letter has been questioned. Its authenticity has been questioned by some, but it's never been it's never been shown just to be something that's false. So the way we handle documents like that, when the provenance is not ironclad, the way we handle that is we read the document and we discern what's being said in the document. Does it make sense? Is it reasonable? Does it comport with reality? And then we can make up our mind on whether or not it makes sense. Because whether or not it was intended for what they say it was intended for, nonetheless, here it is in existence. And many people have read and shared this document over time as a way to try to understand what's going on in the world. So having consolidated their financial grip on most of the European nations by the middle of the last century, the international bankers worked feverishly to extend their sphere of influence to the ends of the earth in preparation for their final assault on the United States of America, a nation which through its unique constitution remains free even to this day, even if by such a small thread. Now that's the setup. So here's the Here's the meat of the letter from Albert Pike to Giuseppe Mazzini, where what people say about this letter is that it predicted all the world wars, that they all knew what was going to happen before it happened. But let's just read what actually the plan was. It says, in the decades that followed, it became apparent that in order to achieve their goal of world domination, they would have to instigate the old world order in preparation for the construction of the new world order. So that means tear it all down. Take everyone back to austerity. Take everyone back to struggle, back to times where you didn't have power. You notice what the Green Movement is about, Agenda 21. Agenda 21 documents, the one I share with you on this channel a lot, says very plainly in the document that their goal is to reduce power usage to pre-1985 levels. There are 2 billion more people in the world today than there were back then. And they want to reduce power consumption to levels before that. That means that they want to take most of the developed world back toward a third world identity. Tear it down so you can rebuild it in your image. The same way that they do mind control is the same way that you create a new world order. This plan was outlined in graphic detail by Albert Pike, the sovereign Grand Commander of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, and the top illuminist in America. In a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini dated August 15, 1871, Albert Pike stated that the First World War was to be fomented in order to destroy Tsarist Russia and to place that vast land under the direct control of Illuminati agents. Russia was then to be used as the bogeyman to further the claims of the Illuminati worldwide. It goes on to say World War II was to be fomented through manipulation of the differences that existed between the German nationalists and the political Zionists. Seems to be exactly the way it turned out. This was to result in an expansion of Russian influence and the establishment of a state of Israel in Palestine. Okay, now the reason I've read those two accounts there to you is because that's what happened. So when we're trying to determine whether or not a document is real, well, does it comport with reality? Yes. The things that if the letter can be shown to be from 1871, then these predictions are astounding. So let's see what it has to say about now. What does it say about the Third World War? The Third World War was planned to result from the differences stirred up by Illuminati agents between Zionists and the Arabs. The conflict was planned to spread worldwide. The Illuminati planned to unleash, listen carefully, the Illuminati, or these men in power, whatever, bankers, whatever, doesn't matter. We know it's just a small group of people. The Illuminati planned to unleash the nihilists and the atheists and provoke a formidable social cataclysm which in all its horror will show clearly to the nations the effect of absolute atheism, the origin of savagery, and of the most bloody turmoil. I mean, this is really interesting because what's being said here is that the goal is to unleash the ungodly, is to fire up all the ungodly in the world and get them excited and send them out on a mission to tear everything down. But the reason why is what's interesting. Not because they want to promote atheism or even nihilism. It's because they want to get rid of all the minds that are not religious. Because they know it's only they want to institute the Luciferian order. An order in the world that honors, worships, and follows Satan. That's the idea. And you can't have someone loyal to Satan if they don't already have a religious mind, a mind that's open to religion. That's my assessment of it anyway. That might not be exactly right, but that's what I see, and that's what we seem to see around us. It's the reason why that seems to surprise most people. It's not because they want to institute atheism all over the world. That would be ridiculous. You couldn't do that. There's not enough people that are willing to say there is no God. That's a very small group of people when you get right down to it. Atheism is an aberration in the mind of man. It's not normal. It's not the normal way that people see the world and their existence. It's unusual and very much false. Let's go on here. It says, then everywhere the citizens obliged to defend themselves. All right, so fire up all the atheists and nihilists, fire up all the ungodly people, and force everyone else in the world to have to defend themselves. Does that not sound quite familiar when you see what we've got going on today? So these citizens, obliged to defend themselves against the world minority of revolutionaries, will exterminate those destroyers of civilization and the multitude disillusioned with Christianity, whose deistic spirits will from that moment be without compass or direction, anxious for an ideal, but without knowing where to render their adoration. And then at that time they will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out in the public view, a manifestation which will result from the general reactionary movement, which will follow the destruction of Christianity and atheism, both conquered and exterminated at the same time. That's the goal. The goal of what you see today, in my humble opinion, the goal of it all is the destruction of atheism and Christianity, to make way for what they call manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer. Okay, so let's take a look at. Now I'm going to go into the document now, the document that's in that's linked in the description. Satanic cult awareness. Let's see how that thing's going in the chat. All right, good to see you guys out there. Michael DeSilvio. Good to see you out there. Some new names. All right, folks, let's keep on here. So I'm going to go into the document now, the one that's linked in the description, all the way down to the bottom. And here's a section called Investigative Suggestions for Law Enforcement. Now, what are we trying to do? What's the thesis here? What's the goal of this presentation? Since this is, I probably need to mention, no, this is not, I didn't call this one a devotion like we normally do on Sundays at 4 o'clock outdoors. Because of the material we're covering here, this is more of an investigation. So it's an AOT investigation. But it's one I've been wanting to do for a long time, and I want to do probably a more concise and focused video on this topic. So I thought I would introduce it here to you today. So let's talk about what are we actually doing. We're trying to show how the movement we see around us today is essentially, and most likely, a satanic cult. And to do that, we have to look at the attributes of a satanic cult and see, do we see those in this progressive, I don't like the word liberal because they've taken it and co-opted it, progressive, globalist, technocratic, utopians, and then the people that they've hired to go out in the streets and do their bidding. Do we see those attributes today? So in some investigative suggestions here for law enforcement, they say things like this: terrorist cults and cults which specialize in hate. You can't classify what you see in our streets today, the riots, the violent protesters, the mostly peaceful protesters. They fit this to a T. They specialize in hate, all the while saying that they represent unity and love. This is exactly how Satan operates in Genesis chapter 3 and all through the New Testament, wherever he shows up. They specialize in hate generally, use many different names, and have various front organizations. So for the Black Lives Matter movement, we can be assured that as much as we know about it, its founder, one of its founders, Patrice Cullors, follows the religion of Ifa, which is a Caribbean West African founded religion that is essentially what we would recognize as voodoo. It's voodoo. So when you see some of the actions, taking a knee, putting the hand up, putting the fist up, all these gestures, and then incantations that come behind it, or oaths that people have to make, renouncing their white privilege and all that, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing essentially religious activities. We're watching mind control play out on our screens. They develop as much information as they can. For example, identity of the leaders, their beliefs, recruitment techniques, etc., before taking any action. So they're very well organized. These are not fly-by-night operations. They have the biggest money and the best organizers behind them. Now, what law enforcement says here from their investigations is this: these groups, most of these groups, have automatic weapons stockpiled. So, you have to know what to expect with these. They also say some cults are using quasi-legitimate businesses as fronts for trafficking in narcotics, any way that they can to make money, to fund their operation. Today, you don't necessarily see that as much, where in the past you would see things like drug trafficking, gun running, anything that could make you a lot of money fast was a way to fund these outfits, these operations. Today, they're funded by corporations that are just out in the open. How many corporations have you seen that have proudly donated to BLM, a movement that has vowed to tear America apart? What's going on? I mean, how can you do that and people still buy your products? Why don't we just say no? If you're going to donate to an organization that plans to destroy my life, I'm not going to buy your products. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? Because we're too comfortable. We're too fat, happy, and comfortable to do much of anything. So we stay on our couches hoping to push it off into the distance one more day. One of these days, they're going to come and knock on your door. What are you going to do then? Many non-traditional satanic cults deal in, of course, using drugs, child abuse, human sacrifice, forms of mind control, which we've talked about, to keep their members from leaving. Now, what's going to be interesting is, maybe in the years to come, if we're given that opportunity, Lord willing, that we'll see people who've come out of these movements will report exactly this. Because all the attributes we see from the outside look like this. Note that many traditional, what they call here. Now, this is one of the interesting notes from what law enforcement here has said, that we would tend to disagree with on a fundamental level. They say this: to make note that many traditional so-called white witchcraft and satanic cults are legitimate, sometimes even helpful to police when investigating occult crimes. Many are eager to give information on those cults engaged in criminal activity because they are giving them a bad name. And it says here to be able to differentiate between those two groups in your area. Now, it would be good. It is good advice to be able to know which one of these groups is fomenting violence and which of them is opposed to that. But more important is to understand that they both work for the same master. Their ends will be exactly the same. Even though these so-called white witches over here might deplore the violence and chaos that's going over here, they can't claim that it's bad, because they know that in their own practice, these people are just exercising their authority, their autonomy, their right-hand path. Since the Mariel boat lifts of 1980, many voodoo cults are now operating in this country, United States. And the advice here is to understand the various signs and symbols connected with these groups, particularly drawings of fowl, dolls, saints, painted rocks, coins, etc. Some of these groups are involved in narcotics, murder, extortion, and occasional human sacrifice. All right, so the important piece out of here is, since the Mariel boat lifts of 1980, many voodoo cults are now operating in this country. That's the point. Many voodoo cults now operating in this country. That's something that law enforcement has identified. That's not me just saying, ooh, isn't it weird? There's all these cults. No, that's what these people who investigate this have found. And what have we just learned? That one of the founders of BLM, Patrice Cullors, very proudly subscribes to the religion of Ifa, a voodoo cult. So there, we can see the correlations. All right, so let's go to the next piece. So we're talking about destructive religious cults and ants. Lots of ants. Just a second here, folks, with me. Okay, I'm back. I had to deal with some critters, some visitors, some friends that want to help me out, but I don't really need their help today for anything I'm doing. We're going to talk about that place. We're going to talk about, well, the Church of Satan. We're going to talk about the Church of Satan here. The reason is we want to identify what does the Church of Satan actually teach? And then let's apply it to what we see in these movements. The Church of Satan worships Satan. Okay, there's a little bit of obvious for you. Most clearly symbolized in the Roman god Lucifer, the bearer of light, the spirit of the air, and the personification of enlightenment. The personification of enlightenment. What is the globalist progressive movement? What are they selling? They're selling to you that communitarianism, or that globalism, this new form of communism, they're selling to you that is the new enlightened form of political discourse. And if you insist on individual rights and liberties, then you're selfish. But now that's not exactly what Satanism teaches. Let's keep going here. But they do teach this personification of enlightenment, and they're selling enlightenment as slavery. So it's always the double bind with Satan. Satan is not visualized as an anthropomorphic being. Rather, he represents the forces of nature. To the Satanist, the self is the highest embodiment of human life and is sacred. The self. Now think about the transgender movement. LGBTQ+++. Think about the transgender movement, because the BLM movement is essentially a movement for LGBTQ plus individuals. They're more, they should give themselves that title. They've co-opted what would be a legitimate movement of concern from black Americans. They've co-opted that, and now it's this new movement to destroy America and bring on a luciferian doctrine. To the Satanist, the self is the highest embodiment of human life and is sacred. The Church of Satan is essentially a human potential movement. What does Joel Osteen teach every week from his massive pulpit? He teaches self-improvement. To the Satanist, the self is the highest embodiment of human life and is sacred. The Church of Satan is essentially a human potential movement. and members are encouraged to develop whatever capabilities they can by which they might excel. They are, however, cautioned to recognize their limitations, an important factor in this philosophy of rational self-interest. Satanists practice magic, with a K, the art of changing situations or events in accordance with one's will, which would, using normally accepted methods, be impossible. Now, let's just think about that for a minute. We know that these are the underlying teachings of occultism, Western esotericism, the New Age movement. It all lines up with Satanism. You can't, if you're in the New Age, you can't get rid of the fact that your movement is satanic. It is in opposition to the law of God. And here's what this last piece said, which I thought was really interesting. Satanists practice magic, the art of changing situations or events in accordance with one's will. Think about that. What if all of us, right now, could change the world and everything around us to our will? Can you imagine what 7 billion different realities occurring at one time might look like? So you see, Satanism is founded on some very basic, invalid thoughts, invalid ideas, things that can't exist. The writings of Anton LaVey provide the direction for the Satanists. The Satanic Bible, for example, the Complete Witch, and the Satanic Rituals. Members are encouraged to study pertinent writings which serve as guidelines for Satanic thought, such as the works of Mark Twain, Niccolo Machiavelli, G.S. Shaw, Ayn Rand, Friedrich Nietzsche, and on and on. So many of the Western philosophers held these kind of ideas. Any philosophy that puts the person and the self at the highest level of the hierarchy is satanic. That is Lucifer. Lucifer wants God's seat. He doesn't want to play his role. He wants God's seat. And that is essentially what Satanism teaches, is that you deserve all the power. Now, ethical practices. Let's look at the ethical practices mentioned in the Church of Satan. Once again, this document is linked in your description. You can find it there to look at it for yourself. It's very interesting when you look at this document for yourself, when they list a lot of organizations that hold these thoughts. Look at that list and look at how many have Christian in their name. Very weird. Very interesting. And we know that that's the case, that there are many organizations that appropriate the name or a mask of Christianity who are really working for Satan. Joel Osteen would be one. Todd White would be another. We don't need to name all those people right now. Ethical practices. The ethical stance of the Church of Satan is summarized in the 9 satanic statements, and here they are. Number 1, Satan represents indulgence instead of abstinence. Think about your reality. Think about the world we live in. Indulgence instead of abstinence. So, indulge if you feel, if something feels good to you, just indulge it, no matter what it is. That is what we see all around us. Do maybe in fact we live in a satanic society? Is that possible? Yeah, well, it seems like it is. Number 2, Satan represents vital existence instead of spiritual pipe dreams. So instead of all those words about righteousness through faith alone, in Christ alone, instead of all that, get it all right now. Get as much as you can right now. Satisfy your desires now. Don't fall for those lies, those spiritual pipe dreams, they call it. And what do we see happening in this country right now? Christianity is being squeezed, not allowed to exist freely. Number 3, Satan represents undefiled wisdom instead of hypocritical self-deceit. So, to the Satanist, undefiled wisdom would be Lucifer's position. And hypocritical self-deceit would be those who follow Jesus Christ. Number 4, Satan represents kindness to those who deserve it, instead of love wasted on ingrates. So in Satanism, you only accept those people who look and think like you. Is that familiar with you? If you don't join the movement today, the BLM movement might come into a restaurant where you're sitting and they might tell you, put your fist in the air or I'm going to, I don't know, beat you up. That's number 4. Kindness to those who deserve it, instead of love wasted on ingrates. To the Christian, what do you deserve as a Christian? We know, we're very clear, the Christian worldview is perfectly clear on this matter. We deserve wrath, and we know that, and that's why we submit, and we are humble. We're humble, and we submit to Jesus Christ, but not the Satanist. The Satanist will determine for himself who deserves it. Number 5, Satan represents vengeance, instead of turning the other cheek. That one's self-explanatory. Number 6, Satan represents responsibility for the responsible, instead of concern for psychic vampires. Now that one's funny because they are the psychic vampires. Number 7, Satan represents man as just another animal. Evolution. And why do we see so many people today so vehemently defending evolution as though their life depended on it? Why do we see that? Because I think, my friends, we find ourselves living in a society that is mostly satanic. And they don't even realize it. Most of the society doesn't realize that they're walking in lockstep with Satan. Satan represents man as just another animal, sometimes better, more often worse than those that walk on all fours, who, because of his divine and intellectual development, has become the most vicious animal of all. So, to the Satanist and to these movements as well, man is the ultimate. Man is just another animal, but man has been given this intelligence that puts him a little higher than the other animals by Lucifer. Their intelligence comes from a created being. Christian worldview, our intelligence comes from the Almighty Creator of time, space, and matter. The one who created it all out of nothing gives us our intelligence. So why would you want to take a substandard intelligence? Why would you want intelligence from a created being? It doesn't make any sense. So you can see how Satanism has no real respect for life. So it's very easy to burn someone's business down or murder someone in the street if you're a Satanist, because it's just another animal. Number 8, Satan represents all of the so-called sins as they lead to physical, mental, or emotional gratification. So gratification. Gratifying yourself is number 1 in this mindset. Satan has number 9. Satan has been the best friend the church has ever had, as he has kept it in business all these years. You'll hear that. You'll hear Anton LaVey makes that statement quite a bit when you watch some of his old videos. I don't recommend that you do that, but he says that a lot. That Satan is the best friend the church has ever had because, well, like he said, it keeps the church in business. Is that true? The best friend the church ever had was the one who died on the cross for everyone, to give us all an advocate before the Creator. Otherwise, if we stood before Him, we would have nothing. We would be destroyed with the judgment. But Jesus Christ came here. God came into the world in the flesh and provided the perfect sacrifice so that we would all have an invitation to eternal life with Him. Satan doesn't like that. Satan wants the power. So he wants you He wants you to be distracted from the truth. Now let's read this little piece here. How are members recruited into the Church of Satan? Let's see if this sounds like how members are recruited into the current movements we see around us. It says here, the church does not proselytize, the Church of Satan, doesn't proselytize, but welcomes inquiries from honest potential members, Satanists, who hear about the organization from various books or on television, the mass media, or from word of mouth. New members must go through a screening process before they are accepted. The Church of Satan stands as a gathering point for all those who believe in what the Christian church opposes, and members are generally hostile to its teachings and resultant behavior patterns. To a lesser extent, the same position holds for Eastern religions. All right, so do you hear that last piece? To a lesser extent, the same position holds for Eastern religions. So according to the Church of Satan, Eastern religions, where meditation comes from, are really on par with the Church of Satan. But essentially, these movements and those who are promoting them stand as a gathering point for all those who believe in what the Christian church opposes. Our enemy is clearly defined. All right, my friends. Gosh, not much of a voice today. So welcome, my friends. Once again, let me just say greetings to everybody. Welcome to this stream today where we're talking about being aware of satanic cult activity going on all around you. Specifically today, we're talking about these movements, these violent protests, they're riots is what they are. It's what it is, it's an insurgency. It's an insurgency in our society, an uprising, and it's an unholy, unrighteous uprising. And we have to be able to identify it because, listen, they're recruiting your kids right now. In fact, they're recruiting you. And I can imagine when I went off to college, I can imagine being persuaded in some way by this, if for no other reason than is this where the cool kids are hanging out? It can be that simple. So we have to educate ourselves on what are we actually looking at. So we're talking about destructive religious cults. So, and that's what I think Antifa, BLM, and essentially the globalist, the movement for a globalist, technocratic utopia, it is a destructive religious cult. A destructive religious cult is any group which uses psychological manipulation to, number one, impair, destroy, or make captive an individual's freedom of thought or reasoning abilities. This is done with the hidden purpose of promoting the wealth, power, or vanity of charismatic cult leaders. The recruitment, number two, practice is usually deceptive and the victim enters the cult without informed consent. So, that's probably the reason that when we see these movements, you get the video and you get the pictures from the riots, it all looks like the same person, doesn't it? Pretty much the same age bracket. Probably there's a lot of females involved. I think it may be more male, but I'm not sure. But it all seems to be the same age bracket. Actually, for a movement that claims to be so diverse, it seems to be a very narrowly defined demographic. White kids in their early to mid 20s. Maybe 20s to 30s, but is that not interesting? The very people that they say benefit the most from freedom and liberty, which they call white privilege, they're the very people who are involved in the movement to tear it down. Satan is a genius. We have to always be aware of that fact, that our adversary is smarter than we are. And that is why we need the Savior. We need the Holy Spirit working within us. That's the only way we produce good works. All right, so it goes on to say here that the cult leaders demand blind faith in their teachings and restrict the freedom of their followers and direct them to engage in criminal activity. Okay, so blind faith. If you have a child in college, you have a child in high school, they're being preached to by these movements today. You have to assume that. You have to assume that because it's so rampant, and they have infiltrated the whole world, and they have especially infiltrated the education system. So you have to be able to engage your child or your peers or whoever on these points, because what they're going to tell you is that Christians exercise blind faith, which is untrue. That's what this YouTube channel is defined on, is making the point that Christians don't have blind faith. It's okay if you do. In fact, the more you learn about Jesus Christ, the more you know about God, the less evidence you need. But for those who are having trouble believing, evidence helps. So Christian worldview is the only worldview that can be defended in a public forum against all objections. These movements that are wooing and seducing our kids today to become part of some revolution, an unholy revolution, are telling them that Christianity is the opposite, while they're teaching them a new doctrine that is blind faith. The movements of Antifa, BLM, the movement for the globalist technocratic utopia is based on blind faith. What are the techniques of psychological manipulation? All right, so we want to know these because we want to be able to identify it when we see it. We want to be able to help people in our lives that we find are being persuaded by this unholy movement. So some of the techniques of psychological manipulation. Isolation is first of all. Loss of reality induced by physical separation from society and rational reverences. What is a rational reverence? Love of God. The acknowledgement that God exists. And then the acceptance of His doctrine is a rational reverence. So one of the first things that has to be pulled out of someone is their reverence for God. And they have to be separated from anyone who might tell them different, at least until they're fully programmed. So recognize that. Isolation. Isolation is the first on the list of techniques of psychological manipulation. Hypnosis. Loss of reality, or a state of high suggestibility induced by hypnosis, often thinly disguised as Let me know if you can still hear me. I had a glitch on my phone. Can Temple or Seth out there, can you have you still got audio on me? I'll hang on until I see that you guys have yeah, okay. All right, there we go. Okay, so isolation and hypnosis first. And hypnosis, my friends, meditation, transcendental meditation, the meditation that comes along with yoga, the meditation that comes along with Eastern traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, it's hypnosis, it's self-hypnosis. You have to identify that as a potential problem. Peer group pressure. What we're talking about here are techniques of psychological manipulation. And the third is peer group pressure. Your kids, your peers, are most certainly susceptible to peer group pressure. That is the suppression of doubt and resistance to new ideas achieved by exploiting the natural need to belong. That's the one that's going to get your kid when they go to college. Or when they go to high school, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just being in the world. That's the one that gets us. All of us. We're all susceptible to peer group pressure. And what does it do? It reduces our resistance to lies. The Christian worldview is founded, is based on reason, logic, and evidence. These other worldviews, specifically this satanic cult worldview, aims to suppress your ability to tell fact from fiction. That's the idea today behind relativism, moral relativism, where it might be true for you, but that's not true for me. It doesn't have to be true for me. I create my own reality with my words. Really? Do you? Do you? Let me see you create an atom. Create an atom with your words. You can't do it. So you really can't create anything with your words. But you can be persuaded, and you can be made very suggestible to lies from someone else's words. All right, the fourth way that cults use techniques, the techniques of cults for psychological manipulation, is love bombing. The sense of family and belonging contrived through physical contact, touching, and flattery. You know, the only way that you can be accepted into this new generation is if you put your fist in the air and say an oath to renounce your white privilege. And then you'll be part of our group. Number 5, technique, a cultish technique, is the removal of privacy. So the person, your handler, always has to be checking in on you, checking up on you, wants to know what you're doing in all areas of your life. It goes on to things like sleep deprivation and fatigue, games, or like team building exercises. Meta communication is a big one, which is subliminal messages implanted by stressing certain keywords or phrases in long, confusing lectures. So you get a group like we see in a lot of videos from the, or if you've actually been out to some of these protests, you get a riser and you get a person standing up talking to the crowd. And it is very skillfully designed, because it goes like this. Bring them up, bring them up, bring them up, calm them down, calm them down, calm them down. Bring them up, and they're carrying these people's emotions along. In the same way that we share the gospel, by appealing to a person's intellect, making them thirsty, and then giving them water. But the difference is, everything you're delivering in the gospel is truth. The difference is here, the reason they have to use meta communication or subliminal messages is because it's not founded in truth. Because we're made in the image of God, we will immediately recoil to something that's not true, something that doesn't seem or sound right. So that has to be programmed out of you. There is no need when sharing the gospel to use subliminal messages. You just tell them the truth. So that's one of the big differences as well. Another one of the techniques, no questions allowed. Automatic acceptance of beliefs accomplished by discouraging questions. Now you can see that this has everything in common with religious cult, the more common religious cults. Mormonism, Jehovah's Witness, for example, very common religious cults today. You're not allowed to question. You're not allowed to ask any question you want to ask. Let's put it that way. There's some things that aren't allowed to be asked. If you're in a church or you're in a body of believers where certain questions are not allowed to be asked, leave. Just get out. That's not... Jesus Christ said, I've done nothing in secret. There's no need for secret when you're standing in the truth. Also, another technique of cults is to use confusing doctrine, complex lectures on incomprehensible doctrine, encouraging the rejection of logic. Isn't that interesting? Because you'll hear that from these groups, is that, look, we just believe in evidence. We follow the science. Do you? Do you really? What they've built up is a blind allegiance to a religious doctrine. One of those that we see today is scientism, where you hear people saying that a lot today. I'm going to vote for science. What does that mean? What does that mean? What if another scientist came up to you and told you that there's really no need to wear a mask? It doesn't really do anything. It's really just a symbol. Would you still vote for the science? You see what I mean by this indoctrination? Also, one of the most important techniques of indoctrination to the cults is rejection of old values, acceptance of a new lifestyle, which is accelerated by constantly denouncing former values and beliefs. Why is YouTube full of what I call pop atheists? Atheists who make it their career to be an atheist. What if I chose to make my career out of something that I don't believe in? What is that? How do I make a career? How do I build a doctrine out of something I don't believe in? That's ridiculous behavior. But that's very common today. And these are the ones who are standing up and saying, we just stand on truth. We believe in evidence and logic and science, but they don't have any idea, or they're totally ignoring where all those laws of science actually came from. Also, confession. Confession is a big technique of cult indoctrination. Destruction of personal egos. Have you ever heard someone say to you, people in the New Age movement, for example, you have to kill your ego. You have to go through ego death. Increased vulnerability to new teachings and recruits. Weaknesses are revealed through sharing innermost secrets. So, ego death, and then sharing, and then being compelled to share all of your deepest secrets with someone. It's bonding. And of course, trauma bonding. Putting people through trauma, whether it's real or perceived, putting people through trauma, and then being the one there to lift them up, making it so, planning it so you're the one there that's there to lift them up. A very strong form of manipulation. Guilt. This is what I would call gaslighting. Using guilt and fear on people. Now here's a big one that we see today. Chanting and singing. Anything that doesn't match up with what the cult is teaching has to be drowned out. Chanting and singing is a way to do that. And if you've seen the video, I can't remember the young guy's name now from Kentucky, who had the red MAGA hat on. And the apparently Native American guy came up with the drum and just started banging it so that the guy couldn't be heard anymore. That is most certainly a characteristic of cult-like activity. Something that is fueled by a satanic worldview. Whereas in the Christian worldview, if we run across objections, I'll just take myself as an example. I'm always excited when I hear someone bring an objection, whether it's in the chat, whether it's out here in the real world on the street, when I'm out talking to people on the street. It's exciting when people bring objections because we have the answer. We have the truth. But on the other hand, this other satanic worldview seeks to drown you out. And one of the ways they do that is chanting and singing. Any non-cult input is screened out by demanding repetition of mind-narrowing chants or phrases when faced with non-cult ideas. So, what do we see when we see the people marching down the street and chanting their epithets? That's part of the mind control. They're just firming up their bonds with one another, and they're drowning out any opposition. That is not the path to truth. Drowning out all opposition or objections is not the path to truth. Disinhibition. Being encouraged to act unresponsibly. If you're an adult, being encouraged to act like a child, to behave like a child, is encouraged. Changes of diet, controlled approval. These people will tell you who it's okay to hang out with. No, you can't hang out with that polo shirt wearing fascist. You see how this works? Controlled approval. And here's a big one. Dress. What kind of dress? I happen to be wearing a black shirt today, but that was a bad idea because of the sun, actually. But I assure you it wasn't because I'm promoting satanic values. It's just what was in my closet. But anyway, the way they dress, here's the point. Your individuality is removed by demanding conformity to the group dress code. Now, when you see Antifa or BLM, whatever, when you see them on the street today, what's one of the things that you notice? They all dress alike. The idea of the individual is gone. It's one mob. And in doing that, it also takes the individuals inside the mob lose grasp on the reality of their own individuality. So if they throw a Molotov cocktail into the passenger seat of a cop car, or if they bust open a business or set it on fire, they feel no personal responsibility for that because they're part of a mob. But what do we know from the Christian worldview? That every one of us, every one of you and myself will answer individually for what we did here. Okay, the last couple here, one of them is flaunting the hierarchy. That is one of the techniques of cult indoctrination. Flaunting hierarchy, the acceptance of cult authority produced by promising advancement. Yeah, you're going to move up in our local BLM movement, right? Give people the hope that they can move up in the organization. Power. And ultimately what they're offering you is salvation. They're preaching salvation. Obviously, it's false salvation. It is not based in truth, and it can only lead to death. It can only lead to chaos and death. And then ultimately you see a financial commitment. At some point, the members are going to be asked to put in some money. Now, the reason you don't see this with the current movements in the streets is because it's all kids. It's all very young people who don't have very much money. And so they're funded. They're well funded by the globalist technocratic utopians who have formed them. Any people that you associated with before who are not part of the cult must be cut out. You cannot communicate with them anymore. That's another technique of cult behavior. And finally, one of the last things, one of the biggest things you'll see is what they've listed here is finger pointing, or a false sense of righteousness created by pointing to the shortcomings of the outside world and other cults. And this also eventually is the downfall of all cults. Is eventually the people inside the cult start to see that it's all founded on lies. And they start finger pointing on the inside. And it will eat itself eventually. But how long? How much damage will this movement succeed in before it peters out? Now, according to this document too, which just gives more indication that what we're seeing in our streets today as a satanic movement, these law enforcement agents have recognized that most cults recruit members in their teens, when prospective members are young, impressionable, and troubled. Why don't you see very many 65 or 70-year-old, or just maybe let's just say more reasonable, even 45, 50-year-old Antifa members out there burning things down in the street? Because they're a little wiser. They've been in the world a little longer, and they're a little more able to see that this is nonsense, this is craziness, this is ridiculousness, that it's founded on lies. What's very interesting or very important to keep in mind if you have a young person in your life, in your family, or you are one, and you've got peers that are young in the age bracket of these movements, you have to remember that the initial approach that's going to be made to you, to potential recruits, you're probably not going to be aware that you're being recruited. You will be solicited to attend discussion sessions and non-religious political subjects, weekend seminars, dinners, get together at the club, whenever that's allowed. And the goal of this technique is to get the recruit alone with other cult members so that psychological manipulation or indoctrination can begin. And so then bonds are made with other cult members. If it's a young man, certainly there's going to be some young ladies there to entice him. You see how easy it is? How easy it is to bring a young man into a cult? It doesn't take much. Believe me, it doesn't take much. But that's another reason why we don't see very many older people as a part of these movements. It's because you have to be a little immature to buy into it. And getting down close to the end now, talking about recruitment by a destructive religious cult. They're also very deceptive. Most cults recruit members in their teens when prospective members are young, impressionable, and troubled. Alright, so that's it. We're there at the end. Now you'll see in that document I would link in the description, you'll see this diagram here, which really lays out in a flow chart the path to when a person becomes mentally unstable or is highly suggestible, right down to the point of where ego death, so-called, occurs and identity destruction occurs. You have to understand, whenever you hear the term, if you hear the term ego death being used by New Agers, by anyone out there claiming to have some authority, that's all ego death means. Destruction of your identity. Destruction of who you are. Which is obviously not healthy. But the only reason that would be done is to build up the person in some other form. Alright, I think I'll save this last piece for later. This last piece, all it deals with is our history and fate. The history and fate of the United States as it stands now. Let me just break it down for you real quick. We'll finish up with this piece right here. So, the United States is at the brink of collapse. Why is that? Well, we can see because people are less capable today of discerning fact from fiction, truth from error. What was once a great and powerful nation, the United States, is now in a free fall. Man, there's a lot of pollen around here. A few more steps in this decline and this great experiment of freedom and liberty will be ruined. Which are not easy words for a person who loves the nation, loves liberty and freedom. These are not easy words to say out loud. But nevertheless, this is the truth. This is the reality which we've been born into. And if you're alive right now, you were meant for these times. As one looks at history, the history of nations from Babylon to Rome to America, it's evident that a divine hand has been protecting and guiding this nation. This country began as a few small colonies on the eastern seaboard and ultimately became the greatest nation in its time. Now here's what Alexis de Tocqueville, a young French philosopher, had to say. A young philosopher of the last century. He said that when he came to our shores to discover this quality that enabled a handful of people to defeat a mighty British Empire 2 times in 35 years. He came here to look for the greatness, to figure out why. Why is this place so successful? He examined America's schools, examined the government and the Constitution, but still didn't fully understand the source of America's strength. He said it was not until he didn't understand why America was great and why it succeeded and why its people were free. He said he never really understood it until he went to the churches of America. Now remember, this is from the last century. This would have been in the 1800s. So he went to the churches of America and found congregations, quote, aflame with righteousness. And then he began to comprehend why the United States of America was as great as it was. So then, upon his return to France, de Tocqueville wrote this, quote, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. That's where we live. We live right there, in the time where America is ceasing to be great. And we stand here as the only defense left. It won't be the military. It won't be the military that saves freedom and liberty. It won't be the government that saves freedom and liberty. It won't be Donald Trump that saves freedom and liberty. It'll be you, your family. It'll be me and mine. It'll be Christians who are not afraid to stand up and say the truth and be ready to accept the consequences. Just as John MacArthur is doing in Los Angeles, in LA County right now, by taking on the health department there in court. Standing up for the constitutional right to assemble and for the constitutional right to keep the government out of the church. That's how we do it. We don't have to take up arms. Although it would be smart, in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, to be armed. Before Jesus sent the apostles out, he told them, to sell your cloak and buy a sword. He didn't just say that because he was afraid that they might get attacked by an animal. He said that because he knew when they went out and started proclaiming the truth that people would get upset and that they would be attacked. And of course, they were. And the apostles were martyred in the process. Are you willing to be martyred for truth? For Jesus Christ? Are you willing? Because if Jesus Christ rose from the dead, then this is not all there is. This is just a small sliver, just a vapor of the true existence. In her youth, the United States was very good. As the United States grew to greatness, she gradually abandoned the principles that made her great. Until today, where today the country is approaching a very tragic end. The process of the decline of America is similar to the decline of the fall of the Roman Empire. So let's examine. Let's go ahead and do this now. I'll do it now. So we'll examine a little bit of the history of the ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, and notice the parallels of the fall of the Roman Empire and where the United States stands right now. So as the early Roman Empire was beginning to develop, it was building on the solid premise that the family unit was the cornerstone of society. Morality and discipline were the cornerstones of the family unit. As the empire developed, liberalism crept in, and the morality and discipline that protected society began to disappear. By the beginning of the 2nd century AD, most families had given in to these new trends, and their children were allowed to do pretty much whatever they wanted. One of those cases where, as a parent, if you're raising your child in a Christian home, or you're raising your child with in a moral foundation, someone on the outside is going to call you a bad parent because you're stifling your child. You're not letting your child experience the world. Of course not. We don't want our children to go out and experience the world. That's craziness. They need to be trained up by us, and then they can go out into the world. But that's not the way of the falling civilization. Having given up the habit of controlling their children, they let their children govern them. Does that sound familiar? Where the children actually become the ones who are in charge by default. And they took pleasure in bleeding themselves white to gratify the expensive whims of their children. The result was that they were succeeded by a generation of idlers and wasters who had grown accustomed to luxury and lost all sense of discipline. That comes from Jerome Carcapino, a book called Daily Life in Ancient Rome. Pretty expensive book, I think, on Amazon now. So the idea there being that what you do when you stop raising your children with a moral foundation based in truth, they grow up to be what we see in our streets today. People who don't have any foundation. They're rudderless. They don't know what truth is, so they react emotionally to everything. While this was going on, Rome witnessed an epidemic of divorces. That was from the same book, cited from the same book. From the same author, we find that a strong women's rights movement developed in Roman society. Some wives evaded the duties of maternity for fear of losing their bodies. Gosh almighty. I shouldn't stand under this tree. Anyway. So to keep their bodies and keep their good looks, women stopped having children. And some took pride in being behind their husbands in no sphere of activity, and vied with them in tests of strength which their sex would seem to forbid. Some were not content to live their lives by their husband's side, but carried on another life without him. So it's obvious that unhappy marriages must have been innumerable at this point as the Roman society was fallen. What about schools? How did schools look during the time when the Roman Empire was falling? They undermined instead of strengthened the children's morals. They mishandled the children's bodies instead of developing them. And if they succeeded in furnishing their minds with a certain amount of information, they were not calculated to perform any loftier or nobler task. So we see this today in our schools, where children are being trained up by Common Core curriculum to be global citizens, to not question authority, to look at transgenderism and say, that's normal. The pupils left school with the heavy luggage of a few practical and commonplace notions laboriously acquired, and of so little value that in the 4th century, Vegetius, that's a tough name, Vegetius, a Roman writer who wrote about the Roman military system, could not take for granted that new recruits for the army would be literate enough, just literate enough to keep the books for the corps. This kind of education led to the continual decline in morality and discipline, and also resulted in decreasing patriotism. The Roman virtues. These Roman virtues of honesty, candor, frugality, and patriotism withered and died. What was left was a people whom neither the vices or the rulers, the vices of the rulers, nor the increasingly bold attacks of foreign enemies could shake out of their apathy. That's us. Apathy. So apathetic. So fat and lazy on our couches that we don't even know when it's the time to stand up. How's that happened? It's been trained into us. That's how a free nation of liberty dies. Is when everyone who is able to stand up and keep that liberty decides to sit down and take a nap. The pupils left school with the heavy luggage of a few practical and already did that. Yeah, so their virtues, they lost their virtues, and this happened the same way that Yuri Bezmenov said it would happen here. In 1980, Yuri Bezmenov defected from Russia. He was a KGB agent, and he defected from Russia. He actually defected from India. He was stationed in India, and he defected out of the Soviet Union to Canada. And that was where he was based for a while, and he wrote something called A Love Letter to America. And you've probably seen his videos on YouTube where he explained very clearly how you destroy a society. And you do so by taking over the schools. You just take over the schools, and then in a couple generations you have a completely different society. The Roman stage was gross and immoral. It was one of the main agencies to which must be attributed the undermining of the originally sound moral life of Roman society. So entertainment, our schools, and then our entertainment. What is entertainment teaching the minds in this country today? The people became so absorbed with indecent representations on stage that they lost all thought and care for the affairs of real life. That comes from a book called Rome, Its Rise and Fall by Philip Myers. Another piece from that book. Another leading factor in the demise of Rome, and as I'm making today, and in the demise of the United States of America today, became a welfare country. Rome became a welfare state. People were encouraged to be idle and to receive money from the government rather than to work and make their own way. Sound familiar? The welfare system was a leading fact of Roman life. The evils that resulted from this misdirected state charity can hardly be overstated. Idleness and all its accompanying vices were fostered to such a degree that we should probably not be wrong in enumerating the practice as one of the chief causes of the demoralization of society. So, another way to demoralize a society, that's the term Yuri Bezmenov used. How do you demoralize a society? First, you remove God. There can be no God. And the way you remove God is by giving them 1,000 gods. If you give the people 1,000 things to worship, then you've essentially taken away the truth. But also, entertainment, our schools, and the reality of a welfare state, which we see more than ever today. It goes far beyond the idea of welfare. It goes into today where it seems like there's a movement today that wants to pay us all to stay at home and not go to work. They want to give us money now so that later on it'll all fall apart and they can take it over. Because if we don't go to work, if we don't keep our own economy up, we will die. We will become dependent upon the government dole. It's obvious that the moral fabric of America today is where the morality of the Roman Empire was nearly 2,000 years ago. Do we not see the breakdown of the home, a strong women's rights movement, a deterioration in the school system, moral decay as espoused by the news and entertainment media and the schools, and welfare eating the heart out of American economy. With regard to these problems, how are we any different from the Roman Empire during its decay? Are we not decaying right now? Why are these things happening in America? Or is that the right question? Maybe the question should be, who has brought America to this brink of destruction? Ultimately, we know that it is our adversary, Satan. But then again, who are the men who Satan controls that have caused this, that are doing this? And will we ever stand up and just speak the truth? Providence had its eye on the United States. America was the land of opportunity. And it still is. Listen, if the progressive, technocratic utopians hate America so much, why do they want to destroy the borders so that everyone can come here? If America is such a bad place, according to this faction in the government, then why are so many people trying to get here? It's because what they say is not true. America was the place where those who were being persecuted for their faith could come and worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. It was a land without a king where one could come and breathe the air of civil liberty. It was the place where one could come and earn a good living for himself and his family. America was the place where dreams came true. There was once a divine hand over America. In 1759, 25 years, more or less, stood between the 13 colonies and freedom from the British. Excuse me. 25 years, and the greatest Protestant nation to ever exist in the history of nations would fly its flag. Keep in mind that the United States of America stands in the world today as the last Protestant bastion. That's us. We're the last Christian bastion in the world. That's worth protecting. In 25 years, the groundwork for the Constitution, republicanism, inalienable rights, and a government of the people, by the people, and for the people had been achieved. In 25 years, that's a miracle. It had never been done in the history of the world. An experiment in government never tried in history was to become the greatest nation the world had ever seen. Many said such a government couldn't work. The Roman Catholic Church had ruled the world under her dictatorial control. She was, and still is, deathly afraid of this experiment in liberty. Let me say that again. The Roman Catholic Church had ruled the world under her dictatorial control for all of that time. But now, she was and now still is. The Roman Catholic system is still deathly afraid of this experiment in liberty. For over 200 years, the Protestant Reformation had challenged the papacy's authority. The papacy gradually began losing her power. An experiment like America was certainly not in the plans of the Roman Catholic system. No nation would be allowed to espouse principles that would bring the papacy down. So any nation out there that existed in such a way that challenged the authority of the Roman Catholic dictatorial system, they're afraid of. They must destroy. So what is the point of this? We have to trace the hierarchy back up to who's ultimately in control. We have our adversary, Satan. He is ultimately in control of all of this dissension in the world. Well, who are the men that he moves like chess pieces? You're getting close to finding out who one of them is. What about the monarchs of Europe? They ruled by permission of the papacy and had wielded tyrannical control for ages with no one to oppose them. Were they now ready to watch the development of a government by the people? Of the people, by the people, and for the people? A clearer rationale would be that they would unite with Rome to stop this American experiment with every weapon at their fingertips. That I submit to you that is the mindset, the idea, the overall architecture of globalism. The technocratic, what is today the technocratic globalist utopia. In the United States of America, nationalism cannot exist if they're to realize their goal. So we must be removed. By the 1550s, the Protestant Reformation had become so extensive in Europe that the papacy began to realize that they must do something to stop it. They realized that if it were not stopped, it could eventually undermine the position of the Roman Catholic dictatorial system. In order to accomplish the destruction of the Protestant Reformation, and now today, the United States of America as the last bastion of biblical Christianity, in order to accomplish the destruction of this, an organization, a secret organization, had to be formed to do this work. One of the major purposes of this organization or movement was to destroy every trace of Protestantism and its principles, including religious freedom, which we see today for the first time in the United States of America being challenged, being squashed, being overlooked, and very few people are actually rising up to protest that. Where are the protests for religious freedom? Where are the protests against people not being allowed to meet, to go to church? Where are the protests for the simple constitutional rights? So keep in mind, one of the main purposes of this group from the time of the Protestant Reformation has been to destroy every trace of Protestantism, including religious freedom, republicanism, representative government, and an economy built around a strong middle class. What does this current movement want? The globalist technocratic utopia needs to have one ruling class and a bunch of serfs. No middle class. Therefore, no American dream. No liberty. Another purpose of this organization was to greatly expand the power and control of itself, of, for example, the papacy, or the globalist, the European banking system, to expand that power throughout the world. And that brings us ultimately full circle back around to where we started, trying to identify who are these people rioting in our streets, who are these people burning down houses and businesses, destroying private property, killing people, and standing up. Who are these people? Who are these people? Where did they come from? Well, we can see very clearly that they're part of, that they exhibit the attributes of a satanic cult, in that they rise up and they fight for something that they don't understand. They don't even know why they're fighting. In other words, they look like a group that has been mind controlled. They don't understand what their purpose and what their function is. They just want change, change, change. But they don't know what that change is. They don't know that that very change, according to what Albert Pike said, that very change that they're out there in the streets yelling for and chanting for, that very change will destroy them. It's intended to destroy them. Remember what Pike said. Pike said the reason that we want to put these two forces, have these two forces clash, the atheists and the nihilists clashing with the Christians, is because they want to get rid of both. So these people in the streets today don't realize that they're fighting for their own demise. They don't realize it. And they don't realize it because, in my opinion, and I've tried to make the case today, they exhibit all the attributes of a satanic cult. Works the same way. All right, so let's see what the guys are saying out here in the chat. I can't do this under this tree again. Next week we have to go somewhere else. It's still producing a lot of pollen. All right, let's see what's happening out here in the chat. I think I'll turn this thing around so you guys don't. There we go. All right, my friends, how's it going out there? It's good to see you. We've got a big group in here today. Welcome to everyone who might be new. Appreciate you joining us today. I hope this has been useful. Good grief, it's almost 2 hours. Cool, see a lot of new names out there in the chat today. Welcome, folks. It's good to see you out there. I wonder if there's any new viewers out there, or if these are just all the usual viewers, just more people chatting, more people tuned in at one time. I'm curious as to why we've got a bigger number today. There's Michael De Silvio, who says, great speech. Thanks, man. I appreciate that. I hope that it would get through somehow. The only problem, or the only thing that I don't know the only thing. One of the things that I see about these presentations that I really need to work on is trying to narrow them and focus them down into something that's a little shorter, because I'm sure that 2 hours is, it's a long time. And people are sometimes intimidated by 2 and 3 hour streams. Tanya S. says, sounds like Jesuits too. Well, in fact, what I was reading to you there was specifically about the Jesuits. That's what I was reading. It was specifically about the Jesuits. I substituted the term organization or globalist technocratic utopia in the place where it said Jesuits many times. But that was, yeah, I would agree with you that anecdotally I would definitely agree. Meaning that it takes, you have to have some sort of evidence to prove what you're saying, and I haven't necessarily done the specific research to show all the Jesuit ties. Other people have. I'm just saying that I haven't done it for a presentation, but that's who I was talking about. The Jesuits and others, any other group out there. Now, we have to understand, I think it's very important to point out that when we talk about the Jesuits, that so we're not talking about everyone who went to a Jesuit school. We're not talking about everyone who works in a Jesuit organization today. We have to be reasonable in our approach to these things, so that we don't end up throwing everyone into the same pot as a globalist technocratic utopia. And just because they happen to have gone to school at a Jesuit university or whatever, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the enemy. You see, that's dialectical thinking. It's black or it's white. It's hot or it's cold. There's nuance in the world. There's nuance in life, and we have to be able to be careful that we don't automatically assume anyone who has a Jesuit affiliation has taken the oath or something. We don't need to assume that. So we need to be careful in how we lay these things out. But there is no mistaking the fact that the Jesuit order is one of, at least in their leadership and at their beginnings, they were known as the secret army of the papacy. And we know through the study of liberation theology that essentially the Roman Catholic doctrine is one of slavery, a type of slavery. Now, I've done a video on liberation theology here. It was one of the Armor of Truth radio shows. So you can look back and find that. It's I can't remember the title, but it's a thumbnail. It's all red. It's got the Pope on there. You're talking about there's Jagzilla. Are you talking about me? Did I ignore your Freemason comment? Throw it back up there again. I'll see if I can see it this time. If you're talking to me anyway. Jagzilla. Let's see what you had to say there. Daniel Apologetics is out there, and Helt says that he can. Yeah, he's the Daniel Apologetics is the one who makes the bite-sized videos, apologetics videos that I encourage everybody to look at. Jackzilla, I can't scroll back on my chat with what I'm using out here, so if you could just pop that, if you can just put it in the chat again, I'll read it and check it out, but I can't scroll, so I have to just read it as it comes up. I assure you, I'm not ignoring anyone's comments, I just don't see most of them. You realize there's a lot of people in here chatting right now. And I'm not on a computer, you see, I'm standing here outside using a little phone. There's Daniel. Appreciate that, brother. Thanks. All right, Jackzilla, let me know what your comment was, and I will definitely address it. I got lots to say about Freemasons. I think that, with Freemasons, we have to do the same thing. We have to be very careful that we don't automatically lump, all the Blue Lodge members, these guys who don't realize what they're doing, and we can't automatically write them off as enemies of God. We have to be sure that, listen, we're all here we're all in the same position here. We're all subject to this fallen world. So we have to be very careful about lumping everyone in with the enemy. Tanya says the Jesuit oath is enough for me to know. Yeah, that Jesuit oath is pretty, it's pretty blatant. It's pretty obvious when you read that. And the only thing we have to try to do is, from that Jesuit oath, you have to be able to show that that's, if you want to say that someone is part of the opposition, or they are actually the enemy, you'll have to show that they know what that oath is, that they took it. Because it's hard to do that. You can, might be safer to assume that the leaders would be more apt to be in that, but probably not just the average person who goes to a Jesuit college, for example. Not every graduate of Georgetown University or Fordham University is a card-carrying member of the Illuminati. All right, so we have to be careful about that. Montana there is talking about the Freemasons. I was just talking about the Freemasons, just to be pretty careful about lumping the Blue Lodge, or the guys that have just joined the Masons, have just joined the lodge. Be careful about lumping those guys in with 33rd degree Scottish Rite. Just be careful about that, because we're all susceptible to falling into deceptions and being tricked, and because our desire here is for sin. Our nature here is for sin. We want to do things that please ourselves, and we're all susceptible to falling into things like that. Well, you might not be susceptible to joining the Masons. I'm not susceptible to joining the Masons, but I might be susceptible to falling into some other kind of deception out here that I don't recognize. Now, I would say that I'm far less likely to do that as a follower of Jesus Christ, who's living every day in God's Word, or that's the goal. You might be less likely to fall for deceptions. I would say that your Holy Spirit indwelling you is really the only way to avoid such things. Anyway, that's a little... Blue Lodge, Montana's asked. Blue Lodge, that just means people who are new, people who have just the lower degrees of Masonry, the grunts, who perhaps don't understand what exists beyond the 30th degree. Useful idiots is probably an effective term. In fact, we should all be careful, because we're all susceptible to becoming useful idiots if we're not careful. So we have to be pretty careful about how we judge other people about that, because we're all susceptible to it. But knowing that you're susceptible to it, having that mindset is your number one defense against it. As soon as you let the pride overtake you and you think, well, I can't, I'm not going to be taken in by the Masons. I'm not going to be taken in by whoever it is out there of some other name. That's, as soon as you say that, you're vulnerable. Montana is saying, what about supporting them? No, you certainly wouldn't want to support anything that comes out of the lodge, or anything that stands against God's word. No, we don't want to support. Let me answer your question more specifically. No, we don't want to support that activity, but we absolutely want to evangelize their heart. And how you do that, well, that's an art. How do you evangelize someone who believes that they're already saved? Who believes that they're already righteous? It takes some skill. And I've tried to do a couple videos about that, about how to do that as well. Dank Bud says, I'm no good and easily corrupted. Amen. I agree. That's me too. And I think that's the safest position to work from, because if you realize your circumstance, it makes it a lot easier. There's Miss Ostrich. Good to see you, Miss Ostrich. Miss Ostrich says, I was misled a few times. Yeah, I've been there too. Being misled by New Age movement today is just really a common thing, and there's a lot of Christians, a lot of new Christians who have been. There's a big movement of New Agers coming out of the New Age and into Christianity, so it's really not all that unique to find someone who spent time in the land of love and light, as they call it. In the same respect, I think it's really interesting how we see so many Muslims who live in areas where they cannot be evangelized by Christians. We hear this report over and over of these Muslims converting to Christianity because they had a dream. They had a dream that shocked them, scared them. They had a dream of Jesus Christ. And this is not just something that's happened a few times. It seems to be the most prevalent case whenever a Muslim today reports converting to Christianity. They seem to be saying, many of them seem to be saying, I had a dream where I saw the truth, the dream that scared me, and I became a Christian. It's really interesting when you see that, because they happen to live in areas where they couldn't be evangelized. Evangelism's not allowed. And they might not get a Christian television or radio station, and their internet is filtered. Or maybe they don't even have it. And so how does God work with them? He gives dreams. I think that's perfect. It's pretty cool. All right, guys, we're right at the 2-hour mark. I think I better cut it off here, because otherwise this one's going to carry on and nobody's going to click on it later because it's going to be too long. I appreciate you guys joining me today. This is a pretty good crowd, a pretty big group. It's good to see you all out there. I appreciate you joining me for today. Get out of this sun, get away from this pollen. I appreciate you folks. Thanks for your support. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button if you would. If you're not subscribed, just go ahead and subscribe. You'll be glad you did. Tap that bell button, go all the way to the top so you can get all the notifications. Do all that stuff so we can try to grow this channel out a little bit, because I'm not here to do this for myself. I'm not here to satisfy my ego. I'm here to share the Word of God and to share the gospel with as many people as possible. First of all. And secondly, I want to overcome the massive move of pop atheism out here on the internet. And this is a full-time ministry that works online and also works in the community out here where I live. And I would like to be able to expand that to other places. So if you're someone who feels compelled to support this mission, you can find those links in the description. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you again live here on Tuesday at 4 o'clock for Armor of Truth Radio. God bless you, my friends. See you next time.